Transhumanism. I've been tracking transhumanism for years, as a probe of the human condition, as a harbinger of the human future. To me, where transhumanism is going reflects what human beings are. Here's why I take transhumanism so seriously. Nothing I can imagine could have greater impact on the future of humanity as individual humans and as the collective human species. Rightly, transhumanism elicits profound questions which strike at the heart of what it means to be human. Does transhumanism have moral boundaries? Would transhuman consciousness change? When would transhumans become a new species? These are the kinds of questions asked by philosophers, specifically by philosophers of biology. What does transhumanism foreshadow? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. No longer science fiction, transhumanism has become real. Genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, AI, alter, fix, and enhance body and brain functions. Examples? Gene therapy to treat disease, brain implants to empower the paralyzed, AI to augment human cognition, eventually merging or melding with large language modules, deep neural networks fed by vast amounts of data. Transhuman benefits? Fixing is fine, but enhancing? Transhuman drawbacks? Bad actors, unintended consequences. Thus, transhuman trade-offs, transhuman tensions. This is why I subject transhumanism to philosophical analysis. To shake up traditional modes of thinking, I start with a skeptic. Why do some oppose transhumanism? I ask a philosopher of biology with big picture vision. He uses developmental systems theory to study evolution, Paul Griffiths.
Opposition to transhumanism is often focused on the idea of human nature, that there is a human nature and that transcending it is only going to be a bad thing. And that's traditionally been because human nature is thought of as something essential and inside us that can't be changed. And interestingly, I take pretty much the opposite view of human nature. I think that human beings are best understood as a developmental system that involves both biology and culture, that it's very flexible, that it has an open-ended capacity to generate human diversity that we won't understand until we've basically added the last chapter to both biology and psychology. And so it's going to be a long time. But oddly enough, even though I have that very open and flexible view of human nature, it makes me quite worried about the idea that we should try to transcend the human. Because I think of a human being as a life cycle that unfolds in a way that is incredibly dependent on a very rich matrix of cultural resources. And we don't fully understand how those things interfere with development in order to produce good or bad outcomes. So for me, the reason for being a little skeptical is that I'm quite sympathetic to the view that human potential diversity is enormous, but to take a human being to a different way of being is to interfere with many of the parameters that are required for normal, healthy development. And to do that when you have no actually understanding of how the system works is to invite goodness knows how many extraordinary side effects.
Although Paul does not have an essentialist view of human nature, he worries about unintended consequences of transhumanism. I worry too, but the march of technology is relentless. It can be slowed, but it cannot be stopped. If transhumanism can happen, it will happen. To make me feel better, I'd now like an advocate to argue that the benefits of human enhancements outweigh its dangers. I meet an expert on molecular biology, cell biology, and the evolution of human biology, Nathan Lentz.
We've been modifying and enhancing our bodies for a very long time. And I think that's in the grand tradition of human nature to not just accept our limits. We're on the cusp now, I think, of some really interesting cures for genetic diseases. Genetic diseases used to be fairly incurable, because correcting someone's DNA, that was what you did in science fiction. But we're now in the process of offering cures to people who we could do very little for before. Cystic fibrosis, beta thalassemia, there was just not much we could do. And now we can. It would be unfair of us to simply throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there's a lot of human babies in that bathwater that we can save with these genetic cures. Now, as we go down that path, we start to enter into much muddier waters in terms of what's ethical. How much is okay to change about a person's genetics? Can we change them even before individuals are born? And this is why philosophy is important, because those are decisions that we want to make together and that we want to make intentionally. And it's the same with human-machine interfaces. I mean, the ability to, for example, allow someone to walk again who is a paraplegic, we're very much on the cusp of that. And I think it would be cruel to not advance that. However, does that mean we should all be cyborgs? Would we swap out our eyes for synthetic eyes? Then that gets into the area of the brain. Well, maybe we could all be a little smarter. We could put a little chip in there. Where does it end before we are all cyborgs? And so that's why, as much as I love science and I like science leading the way, these are important discussions that we need to have with the social sciences and the humanities in the public sphere, so that everyone has a say.
And what are some of the key issues that we need to watch out for?
Well, when do we lose our humanity? At what point do we become as much machine as man, for example? And when do we decide that the uniqueness of a human individual could be sacrificed to the collective? Because you have interests of dignity and individuality that we all cherish, that are key to being human. The more we go down that path, the more we surrender in those regards, including even our free will.
Some would say that that's an inevitable progress, and that's kind of a new kind of evolution.
It may be inevitable. I hope that's not the case. I think what our species, when it's at its best, is deliberative and contemplative, and that we make these decisions carefully.
Nathan recognizes the great benefits of transhuman technologies, especially for treating illness and ameliorating injuries. But he also advises collective wisdom and careful decision-making. The key concern: when would we become more machine than man? When would we lose our humanity? It is now conventional wisdom that electronics-enhanced humans, transhumans, are on the horizon. But does everyone agree that we could add artificial intelligence to human intelligence and create a unified creature? I ask a philosopher who focuses on astrobiology and considers radical kinds of life, Carol Cleland.
But I'm skeptical about this idea that we can so easily add artificial intelligence to human intelligence and successfully create a unified creature. I think it'd be more likely that we, for better or for worse, create a new kind of creature that is machine and is intelligent, hopefully conscious. It's very difficult to tell.
Why hopefully?
Well, it'd be nice that if we're going to create something, that it not only be intelligent, but it also be in some sense self-aware. And so I think a lot of the talk about transhumanism involves enormous number of assumptions that are not well established. Whether or not we could meld our minds with some kind of artificial intelligence, I'm not sure that we can do that. Maybe we can, but I have my doubts.
And yet you're very comfortable thinking about totally different life forms in other places of the universe.
But this is natural life, life that basically arises from chemistry via prebiotic conditions and eventually becomes a form of life that is able to do the kinds of things we do. So I think that's very different than constructing a machine and attaching it to our brains.
There are some things you can do now. You have cochlear implants.
Right.
You have certain types of artificial eyes that can see.
That's really different, though, I think, than having the kind of half human, half machine.
But it doesn't seem to me that different in principle if you're looking for radically different forms of life naturally occurring versus creating it.
Well, we know that life can arise naturally. Ta-da. Right? We don't know that these kinds of half machine, half human forms are possible. And quite frankly, artificial intelligence has been pretty disappointing.
To Carol, true transhumanism is more challenging than even discovering strange extraterrestrial life. Because while we do have one actual example of life in the universe, we do not have an actual example of a full human-machine merger. Now, I wonder, if such a human-machine merger can and will come about, as most believe it can and will, when would it cease being a human being and start being some kind of new species? I ask a philosopher of biology who specializes in systems of classification, Quayshawn Spencer.
Approaches that philosophers of biology have been taking have been rooted in something called relational essentialism, where the things that get to be part of a species, essentially, are relations with respect to the members of that species to other members. So very weird things about shifting into different species can happen. Say that you have a group of organisms that's defined relationally with respect to a particular evolutionary event. And if you have another subgroup of that group of organisms break off with that same type of event, by stipulation, you get another species, let's say. And then so things can be happening that are unknown to the majority group that puts them in a different species.
So how then would that affect a transhuman, as transhumanism becomes more and more sophisticated?
It wouldn't be that conceptually difficult to get your mind around because it's a normal occurrence if organisms are shifting across species, right? What people are thinking about is, well, all these different traits and all these different characters are getting substituted for one another across time, and that's how you get to another species. But that's not really where the state of the field is. It's not focused on the traits and characters of organisms. It's focused on the relations, evolutionary relations, genealogical relations between that group of organisms and another group of organisms. And when those relations change, a lot of times you get to be a member of a different species. So you can have an organism shifting in between different species throughout its existence.
To assess when transhumanism causes or catalyzes a new species to form or split off, Quayshawn advocates a system where only relations are essential, not specific traits. Evolutionary relations, genealogical relations. Would future relations count? In discerning what transhumanism would foreshadow, how to assess what could come. I ask a creative thinker in the philosophies of biology, psychology, medicine, bioethics, Rachell Powell. Rachell, you talk about two tyrannies of transhumanism.
The first tyranny is the tyranny of the present, of presently existing people who tend to be self-interested and short-sighted over the enormous numbers of future people that may come to exist in the future. Because of the way that our moralities have evolved, we have highly limited abilities to think in the long term, to constrain our current goods and actions in order to help others that will come to exist in the future. The tyranny of the future is that, if one takes sort of a long-termist view of ethics, they should take into account the very, very deep futures of the tremendous numbers of human lives that will come to exist in the future. And so what that means is that avoiding existential disasters, avoiding extinctions or severe reversals of human society would be far and away the most important aspect of any policy. Because policies might help us today alleviate poverty, but there are also existential risks to the human species, and were those come to pass, you would have the loss of potentially trillions of valuable lives. And the reason why that's tyrannical is because even having the tiny, tiny probabilities that human beings will exist in numbers in the trillions, quadrillions, escape perhaps the solar system and even the death of the sun and go ahead and spread out amongst the galaxy, the amount of good that would come from that is so tremendous that it presumably, just even a small possibility of that would trump whatever sort of local, more short-sighted goods we might think about.
It's an argument, how do you weight the moral lives of a person 10 billion years from now, and do you do a discounted moral value of people 10 billion years and look at their current expected value? So it gets very complex, and some worry that it could be used as an excuse not to do things today that we should.
Yeah, absolutely. The real question is, what is long-termism adding? And what it's adding is genuinely deep futures.
Is there sufficient difference in the transhumanism development where you would say it's a different species?
Sure. But also then the question is, well, who cares?
Yeah.
You don't want to conflate the continued existence of the human species with the continued existence of humanity in some kind of deep Kantian sense of sort of like rationality. Daughter species that we would give rise to may very well have equal or greater potential for value than we do. I don't think we should be wed to any kind of biological species categories because those don't necessarily have any moral import in and of themselves, just like religion and race and ethnicity are sort of arbitrary bases for discrimination. So too is species categories. What matters is the properties that they instantiate. Sort of like another version of a naturalized version of the scala naturae, where our descendants are, either whether they're transhuman post-persons or perhaps artificial intelligences, that they're sort of like the next stage closer to angels and gods, right, in the scala naturae. But that's not how evolution works at all. It's just a highly radically contingent process, and it makes it impossible to predict what's going to come in the future.
Considering future impact when evaluating present policy makes sense, optimizing long-term with short-term results. As for a nexus between transhumanism and evolution, isn't the way it did happen in the past more a guide, less a constraint of how it can happen in the future? That's why what transhumanism augurs is so uncertain. Moreover, are we not starting to shape our own evolution via biotech and AI? Because transhumanism shares certain appeals with those of religion, a transformed body living beyond normal lifetimes, I'd feel remiss if I did not get a religious perspective. I ask a scientist who is a committed Christian, computational biologist Joshua Swamidass.
There's basically a larger secular voice of people wondering about, what is the next evolution of human? And might there be a singularity? And what does it mean to be human beyond as we understand it now? Some religious folk are a little bit uncomfortable with that, but on the other hand, in the Christian tradition at least, there's this belief that the way we find ourselves human now isn't our final form. When we're resurrected in the next life, there's going to be glorified bodies we're going to get. So this idea that we're not in our final form, there's this other type of human that could arise is actually one place where things are kind of converging between these two worlds, and that's what's making it interesting. Now, there's a lot of over-optimism, I would say, about technology in this space. It's not really clear how you could, with any sort of continuity of self, take a human consciousness and put it in a machine. But I think what we do see in AI in particular is new ways to think about how different types of humans might arise and how it presses on our understanding of human. There's even a great deal of philosophical work about something called embodied cognition and whether or not even consciousness is coherent in a disembodied context. These large language models, when they're in a cloud bouncing between different computers, they don't have the same sense of place in reality that really every other consciousness we've seen really has. But maybe actually being bound to a body is a core aspect of being conscious. One of the interesting things about the Christian tradition, at least, is that you never actually see any human consciousness that's disembodied. Even in the afterlife, you're given a new body. And so that kind of leaves open this idea that maybe it's not actually possible to be conscious without a body, even in the Christian tradition.
I welcome Josh's willingness to speculate because it offers insight into human longings that undergird transhumanism as well as religion. Are there other spiritual visions of transhumanism, spiritual visions writ large? I meet an expert on comparative neuroanatomy and cognition who supports Teilhard de Chardin's vision of a noosphere, Terrence, Deacon.
In one respect, as a species, we're already somewhat transhuman. What I should say is we're transbiological. Language, the symbolic capacities of language, has allowed us to get into each other's heads and to live there to most of our lives. And because of this, we're a species that is larger than individuals. Our thought processes are not just in our heads. Some people have talked about this as an extended mind notion. I think that that's largely true. It's not that consciousness is necessarily extended, but intelligence is. And I want to be clear that I think we should be careful to not think that just intelligence and consciousness are the same thing. I think they're not, and I think it's one of the challenges with the phrase artificial intelligence. But the ability to then link us up in these elaborate ways with these new electronic means that we have has enhanced what was already there. it's going to be even more radical. Our various consciousnesses are going to be much more entangled with each other. Let me put this together with the ideas developed by this Jesuit priest, evolutionary biologist, Teilhard de Chardin. And in his view of human beings, he thinks of us as part of a noosphere. In fact, his view of the noosphere is sort of a future development. I actually think that we've been part of a noosphere for most of our human existence. And the term noosphere comes from the Greek for noos, to be an idea or to be a thought. Sphere, again, the biosphere is about life and the surface of the earth. The noosphere is about how thought has encompassed the earth. And that means that, in a sense, there is a kind of an extended mind that extends over the entire globe. It's probably changing our way of thinking, our way of being, even our self-identity. In the same way that language has, of course, in its use, and the knowledge we get from our cultures affects our identity and the way we think. This is a medium that's going to radically change the way we are what we are. And that means that the noosphere is evolving. The noosphere is becoming different. Will it transition into something very, very different? I think it's an open question. But it will change the consciousness that we have. That makes this a transhuman transition. This is a major transition point, a major inflection point in human evolution.
Terry paints an expansive picture of transhumanism, species-wide and globally connected. But to assess what transhumanism foreshadows, I need to ask, how realistic is any of this transhumanism? From personal enhancement to planetary noosphere. I discuss all this with a rigorous philosopher of science, an expert in evolutionary biology, Massimo Pigliucci.
Every time that I hear the word transhumanism, an ancient Greek word comes to mind, hubris. We still know very little about even the way genes actually work. We know very, very little about what might happen if we attempt to do some deep integration. We're not talking about simply replacing your hips here. We're talking about replacing or integrating part of your brain with an artificial intelligence. We just know so very little, and at the same time, we're kind of rushing headforth. The ethics behind these issues is incredible. The other thing is ChatGPT, and there's been a lot of discussions recently about, oh, this is the beginning of general artificial intelligence. I don't believe that for a second. The human brain works very, very differently from the way in which ChatGPT works. And so there's not only hubris, there is also quite a bit of rushing ahead in directions that are probably actually dead ends. Do I think that artificial intelligence would never get to the point of emulating human intelligence? I have no reason to believe so. After all, human brains are machines. They're biological machines. And so, there is no reason in principle why we shouldn't be able to replicate them. But I don't think we're even close to that line.
In 30 years or 30,000 years, whenever you get to it, and you have general intelligence at that point, will that ipso facto mean that you have phenomenal consciousness?
I don't think we have an answer to that one. That would depend on the architecture. If we're going to get to general intelligence by more or less closely imitating the way the human brain works, then yes, I would bet that consciousness comes with it. The only examples of actual consciousness and general intelligence that we have right now are biological ones. So what makes you think that you can go far from those systems and still get the same result? You may or may not, but the proof is in the pudding, as they say, and we don't have any pudding at the moment.
To assess what transhumanism foreshadows is to probe secular human purpose via philosophical analysis. Such a probe works in two ways: probing alternative futures of human beings driven by accelerating biotech and exponential AI, probing how leading thinkers think about the future, their assumptions, biases, concerns. Transhumanism fits human nature as a developmental system, but worrisome because we don't understand human nature. Transhumanism offers astounding benefits, but requires collective wisdom. Transhumanism could be more challenging than extraterrestrial life, Transhumanism could engender a new species based on its relations, not on its traits. Transhumanism must consider its long-term impact. Would transhumanism consciousness require a body like the Christian afterlife? Transhumanism writ large combines personal enhancement and planetary noosphere. Transhumanism emits hubris. Caution is advised. Thus, what transhumanism foreshadows is diverse and uncertain. It may sound strange, but I find it pleasing when diversity and uncertainty are closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.